We are so grateful to have Renee Garris here today. Renee is an associate instructor at the Germanna Community College in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and she's done a beautiful job of crafting the stories and doing it in a way that is befitting of scholarship, but also has this human touch that I think is critically important. So, Renee, we are so glad to have you here today.
And Marcia, before you go too far, we talked about getting to know one another over the years, but I heard you say New Orleans correctly. So I would like to thank you. Instead of New Orleans or anything else, it is New Orleans. So shout out to Marcia for that. And before I begin my prepared notes, there's someone else I would like to recognize. When I was here last year, I had the opportunity to meet a veteran by the name of Joe Williams. And he and I have spent the last year communicating with one another about what it was like in Vietnam for him. And for a historian, for a scholar, to leave behind my 2019 brain and try to go back to 1968, 69, 70 and understand what it was like for someone that's there is really the most crucial part of getting the story right. And so Joe and I had prepared to meet this morning and just have a cup of coffee and to talk. But one of the last things when I checked my phone before I got in my car to drive up is he had texted to say that he would not be able to make it today. Which I completely understand. But I just want to give a shout out to Joe and let him know that he's in my heart, as are so many of the other veterans that take time to share their story with me. So just a remembrance for them. So it is 2019, and we are 1 year further away from the war that was Vietnam. But we have one more chance to say thank you to our men and women and to their families for their service and for their sacrifice. But that also means that it is one more year that the lines blur on the memory of those days that can never be forgotten, or for some who try really hard to not remember. Today I want to honor the women that served as nurses in Vietnam. This group of women took on the weight of our nation, perhaps unconsciously, but through a simple act, caring for the lives of servicemen. And like so many who went to that faraway country in Southeast Asia, many of these women were barely out of their teens. As the mother of a soon-to-be college freshman daughter who wants to be a nurse, it's hard for me to picture her volunteering to go off to war. But that is what these women did. But before we look to the stories, or some of the stories of these brave women, I want to review a few statistics with you. Approximately 11,000 women served in Vietnam, but not just as nurses. There were physicians, air traffic controllers, translators, intelligence officers, and clerks in various positions, both as enlisted and as officers. But that's just to mention the military women. Many more women volunteered their time through organizations such as the Red Cross, the USO, through religious groups. There were civilian workers, and of course the topic that is most near and dear to my heart, the women who were journalists and photographers that reported throughout the various wars in Southeast Asia. But it was all of these women that broke the types of gender barriers and stereotypes that held so many back before them. I want you to also know that the military women who went to Vietnam, all of them volunteered. 90% of those women were nurses. And I don't have to tell you, if you ask people the question, did women serve in Vietnam? Most people say no. They have no idea the contribution that women made to that war effort. But I guarantee you, if you ask a Vietnam veteran, they will tell you women were there. Some of these women were recent college graduates in their early 20s, but others were seasoned nurses in their 40s. Some had served in Korea before beginning their tour in Vietnam. Most nurses had had less than 2 years on the job for their training before they went to Vietnam. Members of the Army Nurse Corps arrived in Vietnam as early as 1956. That is 10 years before the escalation of the war, and they were there to help train the Vietnamese military nurses. 5 Navy nurses were awarded Purple Hearts. They're the first women to ever receive this award, and that was from 1964. I want you to consider something as you think about all the stories that you've heard today from nurses or about nurses and the wounded that they cared for. An astounding 98% of men who were wounded and made it to a care facility survived their wounds. That's an incredible statistic when you consider the level of medical care from 50 years ago. Remote locations, varying degrees of equipment that were available, 98%. And that should tell you something about the skills of these nurses. It has been reported that the average time from when a serviceman was wounded to reaching some sort of medical care was less than an hour and a half. This was, of course, in large part to the use of helicopters to evacuate the injured. And while this rapid access to medical care certainly boosted the survival rate, it also meant that large numbers of wounded could be brought to one place at one time. Nurses were the first ones to see and assess them. This triage that the injured men received, it required nurses to make split-second decisions about their care. They didn't have the luxury to wait around for a doctor's orders to tell them what they already knew, how to stabilize and treat men that awaited surgery. And this provided them with more autonomy than any nurse stateside would have been allowed. One nurse, Rhonda Marie Knox, who was with the 3rd Field Hospital of the 616 Clearing Company, stated in an interview, and I quote, "That tent became our surgery. It was beyond primitive. It was beyond the MASH movie and the TV show. It was dirty. It was a non-sterile environment. We didn't have enough instruments. We didn't have enough hands. Needless to say, we shared things during surgical procedures that were absolutely needed to save lives, but they weren't stable. We didn't have suction. We didn't have penicillin to irrigate wounds. We didn't have enough blood to transfuse. We just didn't have. What we did have was so many casualties right out of the field. They just brought them all in there. First Cav put their people in that staging unit, hoping we could fix them and send them back into war. So we were way above our heads." While this on-the-spot decision-making became a matter of survival in war and developed leadership skills as well as expertise for nurses closest to the front lines, it often became a liability once these same women returned to male-dominated hospitals in their hometowns. And it was just the staggering number of wounded men that kept coming that seemed impossible to these nurses. The most common image we hold of nurses in Vietnam are those in the surgical intense care and recovery room. But that was not all of the nursing roles. There were also flight nurses who helped transport wounded to larger facilities in Japan, and Navy nurses on ships headed out to the Philippines. But let us not forget that there were many nurses who never saw Vietnam, yet cared for our servicemen, both stateside and on bases throughout the Pacific. I think it's always easy to imagine a Hollywood caricature of nurses in combat, but the nurses who treated the wounded after their initial medical care were often just as traumatized as their sisters in country when they saw the extent and the magnitude of the injuries, as well as the large numbers. And we all know that the mental anguish of the wounded can be just as impactful as their physical wounds. But something else to keep in mind, our nurses treated not only U.S. servicemen, but also other allied troops, American civilians, as well as Vietnamese men, women, and children. No one who has ever treated a child wounded by the ravages of war is ever the same. So what was the impetus for these women to join their brethren in Vietnam? Well, for many, it was a sense of patriotism. They wanted to serve their country. Others felt that if men could fight, then they could support their brothers by being there in a professional capacity. Some went for a sense of adventure, and many used this as an opportunity to have a career, as well as to have their education paid for by serving a tour in Vietnam. And once they were part of the armed forces, their roles and involvement were as diverse as their own backgrounds. No two women had the same experience. And what did a typical day for a nurse look like? Well, first of all, no day was ever typical. 12-hour shifts could become 24 or 36 hours if there was a mass casualty situation. Most spent 6 days a week at their jobs. And as many of the nurses have related in their memories of their time in country, you worked when they needed you, and you rested when you could find the time. When there was downtime, many nurses also volunteered in the communities where they lived, providing medical care, hygiene learning opportunities, orphanage visits, as well as English lessons to Vietnamese men and women. But nurses were also more than just medical providers to the men in their care. They were emotional support when they could be, offering a friendly face and a smile, perhaps reading a letter from a loved one to a patient, or simply talking about the things they had in common. In the 1960s, Lieutenant Colonel Shirley A. Purcell said, and I quote, "We aren't angels. We are simply members of the nursing profession who have seen the need in Vietnam and are here to do our part," end quote. I think there are a lot of people who would disagree with that statement. Many of these women were nurses, or angels, angels of mercy and angels of love. To give an example of their originality, I want to share this with you. Again, I quote, "The nurses used their resourcefulness to overcome a lack of proper equipment, their wit to deal with stress. They made weights for traction by putting stones in a Red Cross bag. They used a piece of plastic gastrointestinal tubing for a drinking straw. Plastic dressing wrappers served as colostomy bags, and they designed and built tables and dressing stands from lumber and discarded scrap. And humor was essential to getting the job done, as well as surviving the days and the nights. And it was rare that a serviceman came in with just a single bullet injury. The triage was often for multiple injuries. It often seemed impossible that someone could survive the massive amount of damage that had been done to their bodies. And of course, wound care wasn't their only mission. They also had to understand and treat malaria, leprosy, dysentery, as well as other tropical diseases. But I think the thing that makes me smile the most, and honestly smirk a bit, is how our nurses were expected to dress upon their initial arrival in Vietnam. Many have reported that while flying to Vietnam, the last stop was Hawaii, and it was there that they would don their dress uniforms, standard issue hose, heels, hats, and gloves. It was one color of fingernail polish, one color lipstick. Now, they were undoubtedly well turned out, beautiful with makeup and hair perfectly in place. But it's that blast of heat, tincture of air fuel, mixed with the pungent smells of fish oil and jungle foliage when they stood at the door to the plane that makes this scene impossible and impractical. Of course, once at their duty stations, that dress uniform was quickly changed for the attire of the battlefield hospital, their fatigues. This changing of the uniform was as real as the changes they were headed for during the next year of their lives. But whether nurses were in a field hospital, a ship, or an airplane, the care they gave our servicemen didn't protect them from the emotional impact of the carnage of this war. Diana Dawn Poole has said, and I quote, "One of my rules was that nurses were not allowed to cry. The wounded and dying men in our care needed our strength. We couldn't indulge in the luxury of our own feelings. On the other hand, I was always straight with the soldiers. I would never say, 'Oh, you're going to be just fine,' if they were on their way out. I didn't lie." End quote. The emotional impact of having to live like this is unfathomable, but there weren't really any other choices. When people say today, "How did you do it?" most nurses will just answer, "You just did." There was not, however, anyone to care for our nurses once they returned from war. And just as each story is distinctive to the person who served, the story of return was just as unique. The American public had no idea what these women had been through, and they weren't interested in hearing their stories either. So without the psychological support network that we now understand is so crucial, our nurses had to just get on with life. A few of the women would turn to one another, but most others would just bury the experience and try to forget. But I want to make sure that we don't forget some people. And I want their families to know that we will never forget their sacrifices. And I am, of course, speaking of the women whose names are on the Vietnam Veterans Wall. Captain Eleanor Alexander and First Lieutenant Hedwig Orlovsky died in November 1967 when their plane crashed on a return trip from hospital duty in Pleiku. First Lieutenant Sharon Lane died in 1969 from shrapnel wounds when rockets hit the 312 evac hospital in Chulai. Second Lieutenant Pamela Donovan died from illness in July 1968, as did Colonel Annie Graham a month later. Second Lieutenants Carol Drasba and Elizabeth Jones died in a helicopter crash near Saigon in February 1966. And Captain Mary Teresa Klinker died alongside 138 other people in the infamous Baby Lift plane crash of April 4th, 1975, while evacuating Vietnamese orphans out of the country. One last aspect of the story of these brave women who have made us so proud and humble as we attempt to express our gratitude to them. Nurses were more than just caregivers to our servicemen. They were a piece of home. And the reason many of these men were in Vietnam fighting. Nurses were often the last person these brave men saw. For those who were lucky enough to survive, it was nurses who helped them to live another day. Nurses reminded them and all of us what is truly important, the value of love and life. So once the war was over and most Americans wanted to just get on with life, these brave men and women were forced to do the same. But through events and talks like this, veterans now have the opportunity to help their nurses. For the women who were forced to put away the memories of life in Vietnam, it is veterans who are helping them to piece together those days in country. It is servicemen who remember the compassion and devotion of so many of these women. For most people, the time in Vietnam passed in a blur, and it was the same for nurses. Chaos and confusion reigned on even a normal day. Time seemed to stand still, but then they would look up and days had passed without notice. But these women were more than just nurses, and more than just women who volunteered in war. They were lifelines for our American servicemen. Thank you.